to ventilate between internal insulation and the wall? Andy, topical question. We've had quite a few people ask about this. We generally recommend fully bonding. There's been a lot of talk about introducing an externally ventilated cavity between the insulation and the masonry wall. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's probably worth acknowledging that both approaches are recognised approaches, and you can see that in sort of Bayes IWI guidance. We definitely have a preference, and our preference is to direct bond the insulation. It's slightly dependent on what the IWI specification is. I think leaving a cavity between insulation and the masonry, it invites a number of challenges. First of all,
Large challenges.
You've got to actually be able to establish the provision for airflow in the cavity, which is a challenge itself, and ensure that that's not disrupted, where you've got a window aperture that's going to obviously bridge that cavity. How do you continue ventilation?
Windows and doors.
Yeah, and doors, yeah. How do you drain it if you are going to, if there's potential for condensate on that sort of external masonry surface? You've obviously got airflow running up the back of the insulation, so you're inviting potential for wind washing of the insulation. You need to be really mindful about how you are going to establish good wind tightness measures for sort of interior drafts and air tightness as well. So potentially a number of challenges, but I think really the main advantage with directly bonding the insulation to the wall is that firstly you're working in some harmony with the existing fabric. You're not sort of decoupling yourself from the fabric. But what we often see in sort of moisture risk analysis is that sort of conventional steady state calculations tend to overstate the risk for actual condensation forming. But when you're looking at moisture risk in sort of dynamic softwares like WFI, what we tend to be looking at more is actually the risks below the condensation threshold. And I think it's much harder to control for that if you're inviting a ventilated cavity, because it is quite often that you exceed the thresholds in that cavity for mould growth on those surfaces. And if you're using something like a directly applied hygroscopic insulation like wood fibre, you can largely abate some of those risks by sort of utilising the material function.
Exactly that, and that's there are many times of the year where a sort of supposedly ventilated cavity is just not ventilating.
Indeed.
A ventilated cavity only ventilates when there's a decent wind that is producing enough high pressure on one side and low pressure on the other side to sort of draw the air through. So there will be plenty of times when the walls are quite wet, they're dumping a whole load of humidity into that cavity. And basically there's no air movement, so the relative humidity in the cavity is very, very high, and the surface of the insulation actually is getting really quite damp. And as you say, it's not necessarily about condensation, it's about creating the right conditions for mould in there. And when you've got plenty of oxygen blowing through there and you've got a very high RH, you're creating ideal conditions for mould. So it's not just an obvious fix for internal wall insulation to introduce that cavity. And as you said, the penetrations like windows and doors are one thing. The penetrations that you've got to create through the external masonry to get enough airflow are really substantial.
Yeah.
And actually that, A, it's a lot of hard work, and B, it's quite damaging to the wall to punch all those holes through. So on a sort of a single-story barn or something like that, where you haven't got floor joists, that's the other thing, is embedded timber, beams and everything that are going through, which again would be potentially quite difficult to measure the RH and monitor the RH in. So on a single-story barn, when you don't have all that sort of embedded timber, I think a ventilated cavity can work well. But when you've got two-story buildings, you've got joists, you've got a lot of penetrations, introducing an airflow between the insulation and the wall, I think, can be very challenging and certainly potentially quite problematic. So, which is why we generally don't recommend it.
Indeed, yeah.
Excellent.